So, you've seen the pictures. Fairy tale castles, right? Instagram perfect. Absolute garbage. Lies, sold to you by every glossy tourist brochure. Because the reality of medieval castle construction, it wasn't glorious. It was a grinding, agonizing, soul-crushing testament to human desperation and a terrifying, brutal efficiency. This was about force. Thousands of men for decades, clawing mountains into submission, stacking stone giants with bare hands and sheer bloody will. But how exactly did an age without power tools, without cranes, without even a single accurate blueprint, force mountains into submission? You, with your safety regulations and ergonomic tools, wouldn't last a single hour on that site. This wasn't building. This was an act of brutal, defiant will. The real question, the agonizing truth. When you strip away the fairy tales, were these monuments to glory or merely colossal tombs built by the forgotten for the utterly ruthless? And would you have been a builder or just another broken body? The very first brick, or rather, the very first massive stone of a large English castle was laid long before any ground was broken. It began with a strategic decision, an almost sacred choice of location. While military defensibility, commanding views, and access to waterways for transport were paramount, another, often overlooked factor dictated whether a site was truly viable: the immediate and convenient proximity of suitable stone quarries. Constructing a castle required an astronomical, almost unfathomable volume of rock, literally mountains to be carved, shaped, and then stacked. For instance, a medium-sized castle keep like that at Rochester Castle, built largely in the 12th century, required hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of cubic feet of finely cut stone. Transporting such colossal quantities over long distances would have been an economic and logistical impossibility, crippling the project before it even began, rendering the most strategically perfect hilltop utterly useless. Therefore, the ideal castle site almost invariably lay either directly atop or within a mere few miles of a viable quarry capable of yielding the necessary building materials, frequently robust limestone or durable sandstone. Types of rock known for their strength, weather resistance, and crucially, their relative ease of working by hand. Imagine the incomprehensible scale of the stone required, not just for the towering curtain walls, but for internal structures, complex gatehouses, keeps that dwarfed cathedrals, and even the castle's incredibly deep, unseen foundations. For example, Caernarfon Castle in Wales, with its distinctive banded masonry of gray and red, didn't just appear, it required vast local resources, extracting its unique stone from nearby sources despite its ornamental finish. Without a conveniently located, geologically stable quarry yielding consistent quality and quantity, the entire project could be deemed utterly unfeasible, forcing powerful lords to choose less ideal defensive positions or incur astronomical, unsustainable costs that could bankrupt a kingdom. But how, without modern geological surveys, without core samples or sophisticated maps, did these medieval engineers pinpoint the precise best places to dig up literal mountains of rock, ensuring quality and quantity for the decades of construction that lay ahead? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. They relied not on science, but on an accumulation of generations of hard-won local knowledge. The keen, experienced observations of skilled masons who possessed an intuitive understanding of rock formations, their working properties, and how they weathered. Perhaps most importantly, they looked for the simple, observable presence of exposed rock faces, riverbeds revealing stone veins, or existing, smaller quarries that had been worked for centuries by local communities. The chosen quarry was not just a source of raw material, it became a brutal, permanent, noisy, and often dangerous extension of the construction site itself. It was a scar on the landscape, a gaping maw that functioned as the unyielding, always hungry heart of the castle's supply chain, feeding the insatiable demand for stone. This raw, resource-driven choice, the desperate need for stone, fundamentally shaped the very location, the architectural possibilities, and ultimately, the enduring, monumental form of these colossal fortresses. Without the rock, there was no castle. Once a site was chosen and the quarry identified, the immediate, overwhelming, and perhaps most terrifying challenge was assembling a workforce of staggering, unprecedented proportions. A living, breathing human machine capable of wrestling stone from the earth, hauling it across treacherous landscapes, and then raising it skyward against gravity. A single large English castle could require hundreds, often thousands, of laborers working concurrently, without pause, for years, even decades, to reach completion. For instance, the meticulously kept records from the construction of Beaumaris Castle in the late 13th century provide a chilling, almost industrial glimpse into this human engine. At its absolute peak, it employed around 3,000 men. This staggering number included approximately 400 highly skilled and highly paid masons, the true artisans, about 30 essential smiths whose forges burned day and night to keep tools sharp, a staggering 2,000 unskilled laborers performing the most grueling, back-breaking, and thankless tasks, and 100 carters managing 60 wagons pulled by 200 powerful, slow-moving oxen. This wasn't a volunteer effort, a communal barn raising. It was a brutally complex system blending the grim realities of feudal duty, often violent conscription, and the desperate lure of paid labor, all managed with ruthless, unyielding efficiency by royal officials and master builders. Peasants tied to the land and their lord often owed weeks or even months of unpaid labor, known as corvée or boon work, which summarily included digging ditches, clearing land, hauling materials, and performing the most arduous, least skilled tasks under constant duress and supervision. Meanwhile, skilled laborers such as master masons, expert carpenters, and indispensable blacksmiths were at the top of the medieval labor market. They were highly paid, often earning several times the meager wage of a common laborer, and were aggressively recruited from across the kingdom, sometimes even from continental Europe, bringing specialized expertise crucial to the project's success. The sheer organizational nightmare of feeding, housing, and managing such a vast, disparate, often illiterate workforce on a remote, frequently hostile, and unsanitary site was immense. These thousands of individuals, many of whom were temporary conscripts, displaced peasants, or economic migrants, represented a significant portion of the local male population, fundamentally disrupting agricultural cycles, family life, and the very fabric of medieval society. The castle site itself quickly swelled into a temporary, bustling, often squalid town, complete with its own rudimentary support services, communal kitchens, makeshift workshops, crude housing, and a constant flow of suppliers and merchants. A noisy, smelly, dangerous, and often lawless microcosm of medieval society, prone to disease and discontent. What was the driving force, the ultimate compulsion, that forced so many from the lowest peasant to the highest master craftsman to undertake such back-breaking, profoundly perilous work for years on end, often far from home and under constant threat of injury, disease, or brutal punishment? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. The forces at play were a potent, inescapable mix of feudal obligation, enforced by the lord's absolute power where refusal could mean severe punishment, loss of land, starvation, or even death, and for the lucky few, the desperate lure of paid work, however meager, in an age of extremely limited economic opportunity. For many, this grueling labor was not a choice but the only path to survival, a desperate means to feed their families, or perhaps, for a daring few, a chance to escape the mundane, cyclical brutality of rural life. This immense human engine, powered by sheer physical endurance, psychological necessity, and often outright coercion, was the hidden, silent power source behind every towering wall, every formidable gatehouse, and every mighty keep that still stands today. It was the absolute, unromanticized truth of medieval might. The process of extracting the raw, colossal stone blocks from the quarry was not merely hard labor. It was a feat of brute force, primal ingenuity, agonizing patience, and a constant dance with death. Medieval quarrying utterly lacked explosives, pneumatic drills, or powerful modern machinery. Instead, it relied entirely on a combination of raw manual labor, surprisingly effective simple tools, and, crucially, the cunning, almost intuitive exploitation of natural geological weaknesses, the very fissures, bedding planes, and fault lines that lay hidden within the living rock itself. Quarrymen, often inheriting centuries of specialized knowledge passed down through generations, would first meticulously identify these natural seams or existing cracks in the rock face that promised a clean, predictable break. Along these lines, they would then painstakingly drill rows of precisely spaced holes using robust, hand-forged iron chisels with various tips driven by heavy, relentless mallets wielded with rhythmic precision. Into these carefully placed holes, they would then hammer wooden wedges, typically made from a strong, absorbent wood like oak or ash. The critical, almost magical step then involved continuously pouring water over these wooden wedges. As the wood absorbed the water, it would swell with an inexorable, silent, and unstoppable force that, over time, sometimes hours, sometimes days depending on the stone and the weather, would cause the massive block of stone to split cleanly and dramatically along the precise line of holes. Some massive individual stones, destined for the deep foundations, the towering curtain walls, or the imposing gatehouses, could weigh several tons, requiring coordinated teams of a dozen or more men and specialized levering tools for extraction. Imagine standing in such a medieval quarry, the air thick and white with choking dust, permeated by the percussive, ceaseless clang of hammers on steel, resonating through the rock. You'd watch a team of men, their faces grimed and bodies strained, laboriously hammering chisels day in and day out, week after week, simply to loosen a single enormous block from the solid, unyielding rock face. The constant noise, the suffocating dust, the perpetual visceral danger from unpredictable rock falls, unstable quarry faces, ricocheting tool fragments, and the tools themselves. It was a hellish, primitive environment where sheer strength, relentless endurance, and an almost fatalistic courage were the only currencies that mattered. Accidents were commonplace, lives were cheap, and the quarrymen's bodies were often broken and scarred long before their time. How did they manage to break off blocks so precisely and so consistently for years on end, shaping the very landscape with such agonizingly rudimentary means and without modern geological maps? Their astonishing precision came not from scientific theory, but from deeply ingrained, highly developed traditional knowledge and practice skill, passed down through generations of quarrymen and master masons through a rigorous apprenticeship system. They intuitively understood the grain of the rock, how it fractured under pressure, and how to apply force most effectively, almost reading the stone itself. Once separated from the main quarry face, these colossal blocks were not immediately sent to the castle site. Instead, they were further dressed and roughly shaped directly at the quarry face by preliminary masons, often called banker masons. This crucial initial step, known as scaffolding or roughing out, involved removing irregular protuberances and excess material. This significantly reduced their overall weight and bulk, making them far easier and more economical to transport, and crucially, saving countless man-hours of fine shaping at the main castle site, streamlining an otherwise impossibly slow and arduous process. This meticulous, dangerous extraction and preliminary shaping defined the very first step in transforming raw earth into an unyielding fortress. Once quarried and roughly shaped, the massive stones faced their next monumental challenge: the arduous, relentless journey of transportation from the quarry to the distant construction site, often miles away over unforgiving, unimproved terrain. This was not merely a logistical problem. It was a grinding, constant nightmare, an unending test of endurance solved only by unimaginable muscle power, rudimentary engineering, and an almost superhuman level of persistence. The primary modes of transport were incredibly robust, heavily built ox-drawn sledges and carts. Oxen, though notoriously slow, possessed unparalleled, unwavering pulling power and astonishing stamina, making them overwhelmingly favored over horses for their ability to haul incredibly heavy loads over the roughest, most uneven ground for extended periods without tiring and requiring less specialized fodder. Sledges, essentially massive, flat wooden platforms, often reinforced with iron runners or bands, were typically reserved for the largest, heaviest blocks, individual stones that could weigh many tons. These were dragged relentlessly over specially prepared, though often still muddy or even temporarily paved tracks, their progress measured in feet per minute rather than miles per hour. Smaller stones, along with other essential bulky building materials like immense quantities of timber for scaffolding and roofs, vast quantities of lime for mortar, water, and all the tools, equipment, and provisions would be loaded onto either robust two-wheeled tumbrels or, more rarely for stability, four-wheeled wagons, each requiring multiple teams of powerful oxen. A single large ox team might only be able to pull a few tons, meaning hundreds upon hundreds of individual, back-breaking journeys were required daily, day in and day out, across all seasons, just to maintain a continuous, agonizingly slow flow of material to the ravenous, insatiable construction site. Consider the appalling, utterly primitive state of medieval roads. Little more than worn dirt tracks, often uneven, deeply rutted by previous traffic, becoming impassable quagmires of thick, clinging mud in wet weather and frozen solid with treacherous ruts and ice in winter. The constant threat of colossal loads bogging down in mud, breaking fragile wooden axles under immense stress, or overturning entirely on steep inclines or sharp turns was ever present, grinding work to an immediate halt and risking severe injury or death to both men and invaluable animals alike. Beyond the terrain, the routes were vulnerable to bandits or even enemy raids, turning every journey into a potential military operation. How did they prevent these catastrophic failures, manage such an enormous supply chain, and keep these vital, fragile lines open day after relentless day for a decade or more, enduring every conceivable hardship? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. They relied on continuous backbreaking, often round-the-clock maintenance of these primitive transport routes. This often involved employing dedicated teams whose sole, thankless job was to repair and smooth the tracks, fill treacherous ruts, remove obstacles, and reinforce especially crucial sections like steep inclines, sharp turns, or river crossings, where temporary bridges or causeways were often hastily constructed. The logistical nightmare extended to managing hundreds of animals, drivers, loading and unloading crews, and even on-site blacksmiths dedicated solely to repairing wagon wheels and sledge runners. The sheer volume of material moved was staggering. A large castle like Dover or Caernarfon might require tens, even hundreds of thousands of tons of stone over its lifespan, each piece painstakingly quarried and then arduously hauled, one agonizing journey at a time. The transportation process alone was a constant, grinding drain on financial resources and human and animal manpower, creating a persistent, critical bottleneck that dictated the agonizingly slow pace of construction. It was a testament to raw persistence, where every mile was a desperate battle against gravity, against unforgiving terrain, against the elements, and against the relentless march of time itself. Before the first meticulously dressed stone of the castle wall could even be glimpsed above ground, an immense and often critically underestimated amount of brutal labor went into establishing the foundations. These were not merely shallow trenches scratched into the topsoil. Medieval castle foundations often extended dozens of feet deep, sometimes reaching solid virgin bedrock, to provide the necessary unshakable stability for walls that would eventually rise over 60 feet high and be more than 10, even 20 feet thick, structures of colossal, unimaginable weight. This preliminary unseen phase involved thousands of laborers, working in the most primitive conditions, equipped with nothing more advanced than sturdy, hand-forged picks to loosen earth and rock, broad shovels for digging, and simple baskets, leather aprons, or primitive stretchers for hauling away excavated earth. They would dig vast quantities of earth, stubborn clay, or solid rock, often entirely by hand, in dark, claustrophobic, and inherently dangerous conditions. The excavated material then had to be laboriously hauled away, frequently up steep inclines, by human chains of sweating, straining men, or by small teams, or strategically used to backfill other areas of the sprawling site. In some particularly challenging cases, such as castles intentionally built on soft, marshy ground near rivers or coastlines for strategic advantage, like Bodiam or Leeds castles, elaborate and incredibly resource-intensive wooden pile foundations were required. Here, hundreds, sometimes thousands of sharpened timber logs, often resilient oak, dense elm, or water-resistant alder, would be driven deep into the earth by teams of men using primitive pile drivers, essentially heavy weights raised by ropes and dropped repeatedly into a guided frame. Each pile required countless agonizing blows, accompanied by the monotonous thud, 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 to secure it firmly, forming a dense, hidden forest of timber designed to stabilize the ground before any stone could be laid. Picture the muddy, claustrophobic, and perpetually damp conditions of digging such a deep, open trench, often without adequate shoring to prevent collapse, risking instantaneous burial and suffocation. The constant threat of collapse, injury from falling earth or rock, or being buried alive was a chilling, daily reality for these anonymous, forgotten laborers, many of whom never saw the castle rise above the level of their own excavation. What prevented these vast, deep excavations from simply filling with water, especially in the notoriously damp and rainy English climate, grinding work to an absolute halt and turning the entire site into an unusable, disease-ridden bog? They employed surprisingly effective, albeit rudimentary and labor-intensive, drainage systems. This involved digging intricate networks of channels, sumps, and smaller trenches to constantly divert groundwater away from the main excavation areas, and often required continuous human chains, working in shifts to constantly bail out accumulating water with buckets, a relentless, exhausting task that never truly ended. The effort involved in these unseen foundations, the subterranean battle against earth and water, could rival or even surpass that of the visible structure above. It formed the very literal bedrock of the castle's longevity, its ability to bear immense weight, and its capacity to withstand centuries of assault. Without these deep, stable footings, these hidden sacrifices of labor and life, even the most massive, meticulously crafted walls would have simply sunk unevenly into the ground, cracked under their own immense weight, or toppled into watery ruin after a few seasons. The true fight for the castle's existence began not with battlements, but with bare hands in the mud and darkness. The magnificent, seemingly impervious stone walls of a medieval castle weren't simply stacked like children's blocks. They were meticulously bonded together with enormous quantities of mortar, the vital glue that held these colossal structures as one monolithic entity. This crucial binding agent was produced often on-site or nearby, in astonishing, continuous quantities, through a demanding, inherently dangerous, and surprisingly precise technological process. The primary ingredient was lime, created by burning vast amounts of locally sourced limestone in massive, purpose-built lime kilns at incredibly high temperatures, often exceeding 900 degrees, 1650 degrees, and sometimes even higher to achieve optimal calcination. This intense process, which removed carbon dioxide from the limestone, converted the calcium carbonate into highly reactive quicklime, calcium oxide. The lime kilns themselves were enormous, permanent stone structures, typically bottle-shaped or cylindrical, designed for efficient, continuous firing. They required constant stoking by dedicated specialized teams for days, sometimes weeks on end, consuming vast quantities of wood or charcoal to reach and maintain the necessary scorching temperatures, creating a perpetual, roaring inferno of heat and smoke. Once produced, this quicklime was then carefully slaked by slowly adding water to it. This was an incredibly dangerous exothermic reaction, generating immense heat and scalding steam, capable of causing severe chemical burns if workers were not extremely cautious, hence the term quicklime. The resulting slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, was then meticulously mixed with vast quantities of sand, typically clean, sharp river sand or pit sand, carefully selected for its granular qualities, and more water. Sometimes, surprisingly, organic additives were incorporated. Animal hair, particularly horsehair, was often added to the mix, acting like a primitive form of tensile rebar, helping to prevent cracking as the mortar cured. Other additions based on empirical knowledge rather than scientific understanding included eggs or even animal blood, which were believed, often correctly, to improve the mortar's strength, plasticity, and workability, making it easier for masons to apply and helping it set faster. How did these medieval builders, without precise chemical analysis or industrial production lines, manage to produce enough high-quality lime and mortar for a castle that might stand for centuries when the process was so slow, incredibly labor-intensive, inherently dangerous, and constantly demanding? Was there some long-lost secret medieval formula for a super mortar that has been lost to time, accounting for their enduring structures? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. As the stone walls began their relentless ascent, medieval builders faced the formidable, seemingly insurmountable challenge of lifting massive stones and other construction materials to ever-increasing heights. This astonishing feat was achieved through a combination of ingenious, albeit incredibly perilous, scaffolding systems and surprisingly powerful primitive cranes. Scaffolding was typically built from stout timber poles, often oak or elm, lashed together with strong ropes or animal sinews, creating towering temporary wooden frameworks. These poles were ingeniously secured into putt-log holes, square openings left intentionally in the masonry as the wall ascended, later filled in or sometimes left visible. These temporary wooden platforms provided essential working surfaces for masons, laborers, and supervisors, allowing them to precisely place stones and apply mortar. For the Herculean task of lifting the heaviest blocks, the most common device was the treadwheel crane, an astonishing piece of human-powered engineering. Essentially a giant hamster wheel operated by one or more men walking inside, it was connected via robust ropes and pulleys to a hoisting mechanism, leveraging simple mechanical advantage to lift immense weights. Animal power, particularly powerful oxen, was also skillfully utilized for heavy lifting, with massive capstans or simple hand-cranked winches for lighter loads. Lighter materials and tools could, of course, be hauled up by hand or with smaller rope and pulley systems. Imagine being one of the men inside that giant, creaking treadwheel or working on a narrow, exposed wooden platform hundreds of feet in the air, with no safety harnesses, no hard hats, and a single slip meaning certain death on the jagged stones below. The constant groaning of timber, the snapping of ropes, the terrifying height, it was an environment of perpetual risk. How did they prevent fatal accidents on a daily basis and ensure the stability of these temporary, towering wooden structures, which sometimes rose higher than the completed walls themselves? While accidents were tragically common and many lives were undoubtedly lost, they were minimized through incredibly strict adherence to proven techniques, the unparalleled skill of master carpenters in constructing robust, load-bearing frameworks, and constant vigilant supervision by experienced foremen. The sheer audacious ingenuity of these wooden machines, coupled with the brutal discipline of the workforce, allowed medieval builders to overcome the most fundamental gravitational challenges inherent in multi-story stone construction, pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible with raw human and animal power. Every stone placed high above the ground was a triumph against physics and a testament to sheer, terrifying audacity. A medieval castle's formidable, almost impregnable strength lay not just in its meticulously crafted outer face, but in the sheer mass and ingenious composition of its thick walls. These defensive behemoths were rarely solid blocks of expensive, finely dressed stone. Instead, they were typically constructed as a layered sandwich, a sophisticated, economical, and incredibly strong engineering solution. The outer and inner faces, known as the ashlar, were indeed meticulously carved blocks of high-quality, durable stone, carefully fitted together by skilled masons with minimal mortar joints, creating a smooth, strong exterior. However, the vast space between these two faces, which could be many feet wide, often 10, 15, or even 20 feet thick in major keeps, was then filled with a cheaper, less refined material called rubble fill or core fill. This core consisted of smaller, irregular stones, broken rock, waste material from the quarry, and crucially, immense quantities of mortar, all poured or packed in and allowed to set. Over time, This mixture coalesced into a solid, almost concrete-like mass that provided immense strength, thermal insulation, and exceptional resistance to siege weaponry like trebuchets and battering rams. Think about a wall that could be 15 feet thick, with a central cavity. How did they ensure that this loose internal core fill settled evenly and bonded properly, especially when pouring wet, heavy mortar into such a deep cavity without creating dangerous voids or weak points that could compromise the entire structure? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. Masons meticulously built the wall in gradual courses, often no more than a few feet at a time vertically. After laying a section of the ashlar faces, they would then pour or pack in the core fill, allowing each section to partially set before the next layer of ashlar and core was added. This painstaking step-by-step process prevented settling, minimized voids, and ensured a consistent, monolithic bond between the inner and outer faces in the core. Additionally, larger through stones or header stones were often laid spanning the width of the wall, tying the ashlar faces directly to the core, further enhancing stability. This layered construction method was incredibly efficient and cost-effective, allowing for truly massive defensive structures to be built with less expensive dressed stone, reserving the high-quality, perfectly cut masonry for the visible, structural, and aesthetically important faces of the wall that face the enemy. While the common laborer provided the sheer, brute brawn for medieval castle construction, the true artistry, the structural integrity, and the technical expertise lay with a highly specialized, rigidly hierarchical, and incredibly skilled group of artisans. At the absolute apex of this pyramid was the master mason, a revered, almost legendary figure. He was far more than just a stonecutter. He was the primary architect, the chief structural engineer, the project manager, and often the chief budget controller, all rolled into one. He conceived the entire design, oversaw its execution, and guided hundreds of skilled craftsmen with his vast knowledge of geometry, physics, and materials. Below him were the indispensable carpenters, masters of wood, vital for everything from constructing the elaborate scaffolding and complex roof trusses to crafting the intricate doors, floors, and even designing and building the fearsome siege engines. Blacksmiths tirelessly operated their roaring forges on site, producing and repairing an endless supply of tools, chisels, hammers, picks, as well as forging hinges, bolts, chains, and even defensive weaponry. Plasterers applied protective and decorative coatings, while other specialized trades like glazers, tilers, and even painters contributed their niche skills. These skilled workers often had their own dedicated workshops on site, forming a vibrant, noisy, and industrious hub of activity that was essential to the daily progress of the castle. Consider the almost unfathomable precision required for cutting and fitting thousands upon thousands of individual stones, or for raising massive timber roofs with complex interlocking joinery, all achieved without power tools, without precise printed schematics, and often with only basic measuring instruments. How did they achieve such astonishing exactness and consistency across decades of continuous, large-scale work? Their astonishing precision was not magic. It was a direct product of rigorous, extensive apprenticeship, highly specialized, hand-forged tools, such as squares, plumb bobs, levels, and sophisticated gauges, and a deep, almost intuitive understanding of materials gained through lifelong practice and inherited knowledge. Masons, for instance, used individual banker marks, unique symbols carved into each stone they worked on, not only to identify their work for payment, but also as a system of quality control, indicating a fierce professional pride and individual accountability for their sections of the castle. These artisans were the true intellect and skill behind the seemingly impossible feats of medieval construction, their collective expertise turning raw materials into enduring monuments. Building a large English castle was not a sprint. It was a grueling, decades-long marathon, a relentless war of attrition against time, materials, and human endurance. The construction of a major stronghold could easily take 10 to 20 years to complete, and sometimes, like the centuries-long expansion of Windsor Castle or the slow, intermittent progress on the Tower of London, it spanned generations. This extended timeline meant a constant, colossal drain on the Lord's treasury, consuming vast sums of money derived from taxes on his populace, rents from his lands, and often substantial contributions from the crown's coffers or even ransoms from captured enemies. Beyond the immense financial cost, there was an immeasurable, unspoken human cost. The work was incredibly dangerous, with accidents from falling stones, collapsing scaffolding, rudimentary lifting mechanisms, and primitive tools being a daily, horrifying reality. The exposure to harsh, relentless weather, unsanitary living conditions on site, and incessant, brutal physical exertion led to widespread illness, crippling injuries, and often agonizing death. Broken bones, amputations, chronic disease, and premature aging were common fates for the laborers. It's clear that these projects demanded immense resources, both material and human, on an almost industrial scale, but with pre-industrial methods. But what was the true cumulative human toll, the grim ledger of lives lost? How many individuals were truly sacrificed to erect these stone behemoths that still stand today? If you want to know the answer to this question, watch this video to the end. While precise casualty figures are tragically scarce due to a lack of detailed record-keeping for the common laborer, it is widely understood and grimly accepted that hundreds, if not thousands of lives were lost over the course of building major castles. These deaths came not just from direct catastrophic accidents, a dropped stone, a snapped rope, a collapsing trench, but also from chronic disease, infection from untreated injuries, exposure, malnutrition, and the sheer grinding attrition of relentless physical labor that simply wore bodies out long before their time. These castles, standing as testaments not only to medieval engineering prowess, but also to the astonishing human endurance and sacrifice, were built in an era where life was cheap, labor was exploited, and ambition was quite literally etched in stone with the sweat and blood of the forgotten masses. So the next time you gaze upon the imposing walls of an English medieval castle, remember this: you're not just looking at a building, you're witnessing the monumental culmination of thousands of lives, decades of relentless toil, and an unparalleled triumph of human ingenuity over raw earth and unforgiving stone. These castles were truly living monuments, born from an era where sheer will and the collective effort of an entire society reshaped the very landscape. They were built not just for defense, but as enduring symbols of power, a testament to what humanity can achieve even with the most primitive tools. Did any of these facts about medieval castle construction surprise you? What other aspects of medieval life would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below. And if you were captivated by the raw truth of medieval might, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more unvarnished history.